Greetings, friends. My name's Eli Sachs. I'm the director of the Jewish Publication Society, and I'm here today with Rabbi Dr. Donniel Hartman, who's the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, where he holds the Kaufman Family Chair in Jewish Philosophy. And most saliently for us today, he's the author of a new JPS book that just came out in November, entitled, you see it here, Who Are the Jews and Who Can We Become? And for those of you who haven't yet read it, it's really a philosophical tour de force, an attempt to rethink and re-narrate and reimagine Jewish peoplehood, Jewish identity, and Jewish life in the 21st century. Rabbi Hartman, Dr. Hartman, thank you for taking the time to speak and think together today, and especially for joining us from Israel amid everything going on right now. Please know that our thoughts and our hearts and our prayers are with you and with those dear to you.
Eli, pleasure to be with you. This is a vacation from Israel for a few moments, so it's nice to be with you.
Well, we are very grateful to be thinking about this wonderful book and its ideas with you. So on the back of this book, in the description of this book, Who Are the Jews? We read the following. We read that this book tackles perhaps the most urgent question facing the Jewish people today. Given unprecedented denominational tribalism, how can we Jews speak of ourselves in collective terms? So can you say a little bit more about this question at the heart of your book? What do you have in mind when you talk about unprecedented denominational tribalism? And why is figuring out how to speak about ourselves in collective terms perhaps the most urgent question facing the Jewish people today?
One of the issues that we have to put on the table is to what extent we want to continue to be a people or not. Do we want to be a collective? There's 14, 15 million of us. That's it. That's all there is. But when you look at the, at the tribalism, I use the word denominational tribalism, but that denominational could be Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Renewal, Post-denominational, Secular, and Nones. It could be one of those. It could be right, left, center, progressive, far left, or whatever other categories you might be. It has Israel, North America. There are so many profound divides. Judaism doesn't unite us. Judaism divides us. Geography doesn't unite us. It divides us. Our politics don't unite us. They divide us. And that wasn't always the case. There were certain things we could always take for granted. Jews could keep more Judaism or less Judaism, and then you'd have a question, whose house do you eat in or do you not eat, and what do you do, and what synagogue you belong to, or all of the above. But there was one thing that was clear. When I said I am a Jew, I understood that my identity was essentially a collective identity. I wasn't speaking about, when I said I am a Jew, I wasn't talking about what I believe. I was talking about where I locate myself, in which people. Now, when we add to this discussion a contemporary challenge in some circles about the whole notion of collective identity, we're being, it's like a perfect storm of so many things pulling us apart. And for me, it's true. I'm a professional Jew. You said Rabbi Doctor. Thank you. I'm Rabbi Doctor. I'm paid to love Judaism. Like I love Judaism, but it's what I'm in. But the truth is, for me as a Jew, I start with being part of a people. I always have. It becomes a part of my Zionism, but it was much deeper than that. Like, this is my people. This is how I see myself. And I don't know, am I going to be alone? Who's with me? So maybe it is one of the most important questions that I'm asking. But for me also, it's a critical juncture that we're at, because we can't assume that Jewishness is a collective identity. And we certainly can't assume that that collective identity has meaning. What story do we tell? Israel, North America, political divides, denominational divides. And so often, people think that what's really important is the denomination they belong to, or they define Jewishness in terms of their own beliefs or political affiliations. But it's not, there's this very, it's not about you, stupid. Jewishness is not about you. It's about something bigger. And so the book is an attempt to put that question on the table and to force us, myself included, to not think about Jewishness as what I believe, but to think about how do we talk in some collective terms. So that's what I meant.
So that's so interesting. So you have this question that matters to you. You have this question that you think matters to so many of us, and you just framed the your kind of search for an answer in terms of what kind of story should we tell. And this, in fact, is a central theme of this book. According to the book, the way we're going to address this question, the way we're going to learn anew how to speak about ourselves in collective terms, is to tell a new story that, in your words, is built on Judaism's foundations. What do you mean by that? Why do we need a story? And why aren't the stories we've inherited enough for us? Why don't they work today?
So first of all, I love the model of a story because when you're talking about identity, a philosophy, a code of behavior just seems like a constraining framework for an identity. Also, I love story because we could all tell the same story and tell it differently. Stories are both something we share, but they give a lot of room for different interpretation. Somebody could emphasize, like, what's the central plot of the story? What's the beginning? What's the end? What's your favorite part of the story? You don't say, what's your favorite part of this philosophy? you know, um, you know, you could say, what's your favorite mitzvah? But story has room for a collective conversation that's not going to be controlled or dominated by one person. And the second part is we've always been a people who've told stories. That's when you look at our tradition doesn't even begin with laws. Our Bible talks in the story mode, and it even obligates Jews to tell stories. And as a 3,000 plus year old people, it's a story seems to me to be a more relevant model or hope or what I was hoping in the book, and I like the book, so I think I'm hoping that I was successful to try to explore that model for talking about us, one that's not that removes power, um, removes monopolies, gives people room. So there was that part. Now, in looking for a new story, we don't really have stories which try to summarize or give a meta lens through which to look at ourselves. We have multiple stories. We have the stories of the world, of the creation of the world. We have the stories of our forefathers and foremothers. We have a story of Egypt. We have the story of exile. We have multiple stories. But as now we can look back from a 3,000-year-old lens, is there any meta lens through which we could filter, but filter through a story, not filter through a code of behavior, not through an ideology? Can we now identify features that we think are key, that should be the building blocks of the way we talk, of the way Jews talk about ourselves?
So I love that idea of kind of looking beyond, specific ideas, specific rules, even sort of specific stories at that more meta level, at that kind of broader, more basic level for those kind of overarching or key themes. And one of the ways in which you try to offer what you call that new Jewish identity meta narrative, that new story, is to try to bring together something you call Genesis Judaism on the one hand and something you call Exodus Judaism on the other. What do you have in mind here? What are Genesis Judaism and Exodus Judaism, and what emerges when we bring them together?
I was My whole life I've been trying to find a way to embrace Jews with different philosophies. Now, pluralism doesn't start as a philosophy. It's really a personality trait. Then you need a philosophy to strengthen it. But for me, I always felt a Jew is a Jew is a Jew. Nothing to do with, and maybe we'll talk about that later, not because Hitler didn't distinguish, but because these are my people. And when I was a rabbi of a JCC, I was a rabbi for a number of years of a JCC in North America, in New Jersey. And I served Jews of all denominations. And now in my work in the Institute, I have Orthodox and secular and traditional and non-traditional and conservative and reform and and everybody in between, and every name that we come up with has 5, 7 to 10 sub definitions. Now, my gut instinct is to want to embrace people. My gut instinct is not to try to find a way to say you're outside, but I'm claimed. And in the book, in the process of writing this book, the chidush, as I would say in yeshiva, the moment that my eyes opened up was when I read Nehemiah chapter 11. And I talk about it in the book, but Nehemiah chapter 11, which is one of the last chapters historically written in the Bible, he summarizes the Jewish people. He says, let me tell you everything that I saw. And he says, God, you're pretty good. God, whatever you promised, you did. You promised this and you promised that. God, you're great. But the truth is that the Bible is the story of the failure of the Jewish people. The Bible is the story of the Jewish people rejecting Judaism. That's in essence what Nehemiah says. And I looked at it and I said, so what does that mean? What does that mean? What did Jews think they were doing? So Nehemiah's story and the prophetic story was God commands and the Jewish people said no. Like you can summarize almost all of the Torah, all of the Bible, and God spoke to Moses saying, speak unto the children of Israel and say unto them, do A, B, C, and D. And the Jewish people saying to Moses, speak to God and say, not interested. Now, that's a pretty when I saw it, I always knew that Jewish observance was tenuous in the Bible. And I always knew that Judaism was challenged in the Bible. But that Nehemiah looks back and says this was a total failure. It almost sounds like a Christian criticism. It sounds almost like Paul, saying that commandment and mitzvah only leads to sin and failure. And if you really want redemption, it's only through faith. So here it is, though, but it's in our book. And this is the story that we chose to tell. So then it caused me to start thinking, 1 second, we're not going to just tell a book about our failure. If this is what we were, what did the first 1,000 years of Jews think they were? Who were we? Because they were Jews. They spoke to them as such. They didn't use the word Jew. They might have viewed Israelite technically, but they belonged. There was something. So was it just, some were failing Orthodox Jews of some, like I go to the shul and I'm failing, and we have a parking lot, but we don't open it up on Shabbos. I drive somewhere, whatever it might be. That outside of North America, there's a very strong phenomena of I'm a sinning Orthodox Jew. So was the biblical Jew just the sinning Jew? How did they see themselves? How did they understand who they were? And then I discovered that it's not that they were sinning Jews. The first 1,000 years, they had a different definition of Judaism. Maybe it wasn't God's aspiration, but that Jews didn't think Judaism was contingent on what you do. And then I discovered it in Genesis. I discovered this very simple idea. God speaks to Abraham and says to Abraham, prove your loyalty to me. Prove to me that you got what it takes. Prove to me that you're willing to enter into unique covenant with me. Go forth. That's the opening word, this crazy word where God starts a conversation with somebody with go forth. It's one of the reasons why God's had such a difficult time in the Bible. God doesn't know human nature. But Abraham, in Abraham, God found a partner. And Abraham goes forth. But God from the beginning says to Abraham, go forth from your father's house, from your homeland. Go to the land that I will show you. And then God says, and it's not, and I'm going to take care of you, and I'm going to put you in the Garden of Eden, and your life is going to be great. In Genesis 12, God immediately shifts to a collective language. And I will make of you a great nation. So who is this nation? This nation enters into a covenant with God independent of anything that they will do. All we have to do is be born. Now, this is not simply a covenant that the Jewish people determined. This is God's first covenant. The Genesis covenant of the Bible is a covenant in which God embraces the descendants, the family of Abraham, as their God, to be their God, and for those people, for them to be God's people. This is a religious covenant almost independent of Judaism, paradoxically, but it's not because it's Judaism. And this becomes this, so many people speak about there's Judaism as a religion and then there's a people. But that's not what's going on here. It's not that there's a national collective identity separate from Judaism as a religion, but that Judaism as a religion sees a core collective feature to it, which has nothing to do with what you believe or what you do. It's Genesis Judaism, I called the Judaism of being. And I lived with that. I felt it. And all of a sudden, things started to make sense. Like, whoa, like, of course. It's not that we're just sinning Jews. There's a feature of Jewishness that has nothing to do with belief. It just has to do with who I am, how I see myself. What does it mean to walk through history with a shared story of 3,000 years? What does it mean to be bound by somebody, independent of anything they do? And then once I had this category, I started to see tens of different expressions of it. It's almost like when you wear a certain lens, all of a sudden you see something. Then all of a sudden the statement, which is Israel, Israelites, even though they have sinned, are still Israelites, which becomes one of the only non-contested dogma of Judaism from the 10th century. Now, we Jews don't agree about anything. We don't agree about anything. We don't agree about God. Half the Jews, according to Maimonides, 80% of the Jews were idol worshippers. It's like, you think we're one, we have a notion of one God? Kabbalah is not one God. Okay, we could say it's only manifestations. Narishkeit. It's multiple gods. There's so much stuff. Just read Moshe Idel. His whole intellectual agenda in his life is to prove that anytime somebody says Judaism says, he tries to prove to you that it's not, that Judaism didn't, that's the role of Kabbalah, to break the system apart. But but now for 1,200 years, a principle that was almost never rejected. A Jew, even though they have sinned, is still a Jew. What does that mean? What does it mean? That means Jewishness is not contingent on that. And then I look into numerous cases of conversion and then issues of boundaries and how this category, all of a sudden it comes to life. And then through this category, I began to understand features of Zionism, features of North American Jewish life, which in the past were, UJ peoplehood. There's peoplehood, and then there's the Judaism people. There's the denominations, and there's people. No, there's something very deep about Jewishness. Now, I must confess, I saw it, but I also love it. Because I love it. It demands loyalty. It demands commitment. It demands tolerance. There's a Torah around this notion of Judaism, which is Genesis Judaism, which puts forth a relationship between the Jewish people and God and the Jewish people, built on, I even use the term intentionally, grace, because it's not dependent on what we do. And it, I could go on and on and on, and I'm sorry if I'm getting all excited, but it's like I'm getting, I love Genesis Judaism. It's
You're,
like it
you're
just
you're getting excited because it's exciting.
it's like my whole soul. Like I love that perspective. I love this that there's a root loyalty. There's a root Jewish identity, simply who you are. And it's not a racial category because you could marry in and you can eventually convert in. It's a way we choose to talk about ourselves as a family. Now, I love that, but at the same time, while the Bible starts with Genesis, it then shifts. And in fact, in the book of Genesis, we have Jews. There is no Judaism in the book of Genesis. There is none. There's, some of the forefathers believe in God. Some of them have tenuous relationships with God. Most of the people are morally mediocre or psychologically dysfunctional. But whatever it is, it's like the book of Genesis is one of the stranger books. But then the text shifts after the Exodus from Egypt, which, by the way, was unconditional. The Bible itself, like these are things, once you have these lenses, you all begin to see something. The Bible doesn't even try to tell us anything about what the Jewish people did in Egypt for which they were deserved of redemption. Like here it was. We were in Egypt for what? 300, 400 years, hundreds of years. What did we do there? Who were we? It's inconsequential because in Genesis Judaism, it just doesn't matter. You were Jews and you were having a hard time and you probably became very Egyptian. And that's all you were. But then in Exodus 19, something dramatically shifts. And God speaks to Moses and says, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, and this is the key word, if you obey my commandments and obey my word and observe my commandments. This if, there is no if in Genesis Judaism. It's unconditional. Abraham creates the umbrella which makes all Jews good Jews. There's no such thing. I love Genesis because there's no such thing as a bad Jew. There's no such thing as a better Jew. There's a Jew as a Jew, and if you don't feel it, then you're not walking in the ways of God. Your religious piety, there's something wrong with you because Genesis Judaism sets that standard. But by Exodus 19, God says, if I now have conditions. Now, for some people, they see Judaism through the lens of Exodus, and Exodus is ultimately expressed in the Ten Commandments. There's no Ten Commandments in Genesis. There's only, I don't know, we're not supposed to eat some part of the thigh, what that is. There's something, and there is circumcision, there is that, but I deal with that in the book, what that means. What it's actually a Genesis commandment. It's not an Exodus one. But God now turns to the Jewish people, says, I want you to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now, I love that idea. I love the idea that to be a Jew is to not be mediocre. I love the idea that to be a Jew is to be commanded to be holy, commanded to emulate God, commanded to be of moral excellence, commanded to aspire to live a spiritual and moral life. Now, the idea of Exodus, not the individual commandments, they're there too, but the core idea of Exodus is the second meta story. The Exodus covenant comes and says, I know that to be a Jew is who you are, but to be a Jew also has to ask yourself, who do you want to become? Who should you be? What does it mean to walk in the world as a Jew? And then to connect to that meta story. I wouldn't be a Jew if we were just a mediocre nothingness. Or we shaped history. We always saw ourselves in terms that had nothing to do with our size and our power. We were at the center of the universe. Now, it's crazy. It's psychotic. It's like it could be a lot of things, but it also produces great people. And we're part of a great people, not only because of Genesis. The greatness of Judaism is because of the expectations of Exodus. And those expectations that you have to stand for something, you have to be something, is also the second part of, I love it. I love it. I hate the fact that it produces good Jews and bad Jews, that it creates arrogance. But the idea that to be a Jew is to stand for something, that is the innovation of Exodus. And so the book is about how these two meta perspectives, then even in the Bible, coexist all the time. And so some people think that Exodus cancels out Genesis, but they don't read the Bible, because the Bible, and then as I show, rabbinic tradition, and in fact, medieval through the modern era, are the ways in which these two categories speak to each other, correct each other. When one wins, Judaism is either unimportant, Judaism is or it's mediocre, or it's small. When the two is when the Jewish people become a force, but for good in our own lives and in the world. And so these two meta stories, this is my Genesis and Exodus stories. And it's not about, when I embrace Exodus, I don't embrace 613 commandments. That's not the story. It's not the Shulchan Aruch. It's the idea of be more, embraced with I love you regardless of what you do. How those two interact creates a remarkable story. And the book traces how this idea, then these two covenants, speak with each other for the next 3,000 years.
So that's so powerful. So we have these two stories, we have these two covenants that, could carry with them the risk of, to use your words, a little bit of psychosis and arrogance, but also the possibility of all of this greatness. So what does this mean for us today? How does this kind of hybrid Genesis Exodus meta narrative help us navigate today's world? What kinds of challenges does it help us address, and how does it help us address them?
The second half of the book tries to raise those questions and raises a number of them. It raises them as it relates to Israel, as it relates to religious pluralism, as it relates to intermarriage. Part of the meta goal of the book is to try to make sure that whenever one covenant becomes too dominant, the other covenant has to be your corrective. So whenever you create a religious world which is hyper-denominational, in which your greatest loyalty is to your version of Exodus, or to your synagogue, or your rabbi, whether it's in North America or whether it's in Israel on issues of state and religion, whenever there is the person, the chief rabbi, the concept of even the chief rabbi, who's going to determine who is a Jew and who is in and who is out, whenever you connect to this pure ideological behavior models and your boundaries follow about who's a good Jew or who's a bad Jew, Genesis has to hunt you. Genesis is your they have to be your conscience. And whenever you become just, this Jewish peoplehood by itself, Jewish survival, there too, Exodus has to hunt you. So like, for an example, for me, we're speaking, I'm in Israel right now, and the issues of Israel are they're literally keep me up at night. That's all I think about. I speak about a Genesis Zionism and an Exodus Zionism. Genesis Zionism is a Zionism which says the Jewish people have a right to be, and that Israel's just about our right to be, just like everybody else. That's it. I just want to be. I want to be safe. I want to be secure. I want my children to be able to live just like anybody else's children. And by that, we mean in the Western world. That's what I want. And that was a very deep impulse of Zionism. And it was a very deep impulse of Jewish support for Israel post-Holocaust. Very, very deep. Like, don't tell me, don't talk to me about what we're just, could Jews be safe? Could we have a home? That really is Genesis Zionism. There's also an Exodus Zionism, which says and asks, so what did we come home for? What are we fighting for? Are we just fighting to be? Or do we have certain goals that this country has to live up to? And so that's an example of how the two have to speak. Now, it could be something as trivial, and this is what the war is about in many ways. Oh, don't worry. Israel right now has to emulate the highest moral principles. But what happens if I follow those? I'm going to die. That's some of the debate around Israel today. Like, again, I'm not getting into too particular, but I do all the time. Do I have to? Is the war in Gaza illegitimate because of civilian casualties? Now, civilian casualties violate my Exodus covenant. They do. They violate them. Every human being is created in the image of God. What do I need to do now? Do I keep on fighting? Do I stop? After October 7th, something that we Israelis didn't think we were dealing with. We really don't know if our children could be safe. Now, Genesis Zionism says to us, you have to destroy Hamas. Exodus Zionism says, how do you fight a just war? Now, I'm not here going to give a prescription, but the two categories, if you don't embrace both of them, there's something about the Jewish people's story that you're missing. I don't want to be a noble victim with, erect the next Yad Vashem for me and tell me about, how, we'll now be the righteous ones who died for our principles. I don't want it. I don't want to be that type of person. I don't want to be the victim. I'm committed to aspiring to moral greatness, but I have to live. And so they both haunt me. Now, when I have my greatest criticisms against Israel, it's when one is too dominant. Now, I'm not saying that there's only one way to express them, that when you balance the two, it gives, you put both in and you have it's like a recipe and it'll come out with, this is your policy. It's not. It's a quest. It's a conversation. So when somebody says, yeah, it doesn't matter, and that's very often from 6,000 to 10,000 miles away, it's very easy for you to be an Exodus Zionist. As we're talking right now, and it's not politically correct in some circles, I'm carrying my gun right now. I have a gun and I've had it for decades. And I'm walking around with it now all the time. All the time. A little footnote, I got a holster on Amazon because you guys are nuts. It's like, you're a gun culture, which is quite special. But you have good stuff. So I had this much more comfortable holster from Amazon. Buying a gun holster on Amazon was an interesting experience. But the holster I have has 35,612 likes. So I figured it's like the American experience. It's very funny. But I'm not doing victimhood. I'm not. I don't want to be that. Genesis says I have a right, that to fight is part of my self-defense is my inalienable right. By the way, also part of my Exodus Judaism. But at the same time, one of the challenges of Gaza and one of the challenges of living in our area is we could fight for our survival, but I don't want to be like everybody else. I do have to answer to a higher authority. And so the way they talk is what's going to determine who we are. And you want to debate. But the minute one covenant is removed, you're missing the essence of the Jewish story. So that's whether it's religious pluralism, whether it's the way you see yourself, or when you come to Israel and what you yearn for and how we think about some of these difficult questions, it comes down to how do we balance Genesis and Exodus in our political, spiritual, moral lives?
So you've now alluded a few times to the war in Gaza. For those watching this, we're recording this conversation on December 21st, 2023. And of course, the book itself that thinks through this framework of Genesis Judaism and Exodus Judaism was written long before the events of October 7th. And you've already begun to think about it, but I'd love to hear more about kind of what's it like revisiting the book in light of that horrific day. Are there ways you've already alluded to this? Are there ways in which the book kind of helps you think about developments of the past 2.5 months? And maybe conversely, are there ways that you would have written the book differently today?
I'm always worried about this question, not just about my book, but it's about everything that I do as a teacher. And the difference between being a prophet and a teacher is the prophet has a truth which they declare from the mountain. And whatever reality is about just doesn't impact them. They have their truth, and their truth doesn't change. But that's why, by the way, at least according again to the Torah, to the Tanakh, prophets were a total failure in their generation. They didn't convince anybody. Nobody changes their mind by the prophets. There's only one case where people were convinced by what a prophet said, and that's Jonah. And it just so happens he was prophesying to non-Jews. There's no case of Jews hearing this prophetic word. And I'm petrified of something that I worked on for so long and tested on tens of thousands of people that I'll become more committed to that. I'll become a prophet. You write your book. I have my book. But so I'm very worried about that. And in everything that we're doing here at the Hartman Institute, I've told everybody, any curriculum that was written before October 7th has to be changed. Nobody could implement a pre-October 7th curriculum in anything that we do. Because an educator doesn't start with their truth. It starts with where people are. Now, again, so I'm very suspicious in general. Now, but if I was right, I think I don't know, I use the word right, but I might have had an insight into a core part of who we are. These categories should survive October 7th. And as I was just talking, they do. I do believe that they do. And when I think about the war in Gaza, when I think about the Palestinian conflict and resolving it afterwards, when I think about some of the major challenges facing Jewish life, they're still there. And so if I was right that this does reflect a certain core sense of Jewishness for 3,000 years, it would be surprising if it would become irrelevant. But I say that with a grain of salt because everybody has to be frightened of being too prophetic and being too in love with their book. Because it's not about the book, it's about how do we create a Jewish life of meaning? So I'm hoping that it still does. I know for me, this is the first time I'm talking about the book since the war started. So I'm re-engaging with it again, and I have to test myself, and some skepticism is worthwhile. That said, there are things that I know I got wrong. And one of them is I was an anti-Semitism poo-pooer my whole life. Now I'm still an anti-Semitism poo-pooer in some sense, in the sense that I don't think Jewish identity could be built on anti-Semitism. I don't. I don't think it's going to create the type of Jewish people we want. And I think Jews today who have to choose to be Jewish, and everybody is a Jew by choice, today Jews have an exit that we never had before. And if you have an exit, and if you have a non-Jewish spouse who is living a Jewish life, but also has another identity, why stay? And I think, so in general, whenever I saw anti-Semitism, I belittled it. And I belittled it both both I belittled it empirically because I think there were grounds to do so. But the truth is, don't tell anybody. I belittled it because it had no part in building a Judaism of meaning. And if I would write this book again, I would have to talk about anti-Semitism because you can't poo-poo it right now. Fear is not just part of the Israeli reality, it's also part of North American Jews' reality. And we need to give an accounting for anti-Semitism. Does anti-Semitism create a stronger Genesis Jewish consciousness? Is it something different? The intersection of Jewish identity and anti-Semitism has no place in this book. And I need to develop it. And I can't answer now how I would do so because I have a research team, which I'm a part of, whose job it is to ask ourselves this question because I have no Torah of anti-Semitism. I don't have one. I never did. And I didn't like it. Of course, I don't like I didn't like it when we built an identity on it. And I think the empirical reality of North American Jewish life, I don't think it's a dramatic existential anti-Semitism. But we are encountering hatred that we don't have categories for. And how my story takes that into account is something that I would have to do. And I'm going to write about it, but it wasn't in the book. Another thing that I speak a lot in the book about the conflict with Palestinians and the obligations of Exodus Zionism for us to do more. But part of it was also built on the sense that we had won the war of Genesis Zionism. Listen, we're the fifth most powerful army in the world, fifth most powerful economy. You know, we're the seventh most happiest people. Again, evidence to how insane we are. But it was okay. Genesis Judaism Zionism has to be dealt with. We have to deal with our security, but we are powerful enough now to take risks. And I leaned very heavily on that side. And I think I have to look at Genesis Zionism again as an unfinished business. And therefore, the balance between the two, not the need to balance the two, but maybe the balance that I pushed for needs to be rethought. Certainly, since I don't want to be a prophet, but I want to be a teacher, how I talk to people's fears and Genesis needs has to be more gracious and more sensitive. And Exodus, Judaism or Exodus Zionism could only win if people feel that you're taking their Genesis needs seriously, or rather their Genesis rights, their Genesis identity seriously. And so that's the categories help, but how they're balanced and how reality shapes how we talk about it. And what are some of the new issues that we have to talk about that I thought we didn't have to talk about? Are examples of how I would rethink. Now, when we did this process together, the reform had come out, the whole judicial reform debate. And literally, I spent 3 months adapting this to the judicial reform and to some of the challenges that it was facing and some of the new anti-democratic forces in Israel. So I got those in. But then there's new challenges, but that's the nature of every time you publish a book, there is a publication date. And but the categories are there, but new Torah needs to be produced. And there's new challenges that we're facing that as teachers, not prophets, we have to give an accounting for and talk to people for where they are so that in the midst of where they are, they can build a life of meaning.
So you've just given us this powerful vision of the need for a new Torah, a Torah of anti-Semitism, an ability to address people's Genesis needs. And maybe I'd love to. Maybe we can conclude our conversation on with precisely that issue. Where else would you like to see us go from here? Are there additional questions that you take to be pressing for Jewish communities going forward? And how do you think we as individuals, as students, as teachers, as communities should go about addressing these issues?
Anti-Semitism is a new one. Other than that, the issues that I address in the book, I believe, are still the central issues facing Jewish life. The relationship between Israel and world Jewry and world Jewry in Israel. The questions of of Israel and the Palestinians, the questions of state and religion in Israel, the questions of Jewish identity and who is a Jew in conversion, the questions of what does it mean to be a part of a people who are now intermarrying, the question of pluralism. These issues are still there. Anti-Semitism is a new one, but the questions themselves are getting harder. It's harder today to advocate for a two-state solution, not because it's less necessary, because what does it mean? How do you advocate for something when you're in the presence of evil, when you feel that there is now evil at your doorstep? What does that mean to you? What does it mean that I don't want to nobody has the statistics, and in any event, everybody just quotes the statistics that they want to hear in any of that they want. But there is a young generation of Jews who are questioning far more deeply their relationship with Israel. Now, the book speaks to it, but the challenges are more acute. And the intersection between identity and Judaism, the book speaks about our complex identities as being Jews and progressives or liberals, but it's more acute than before. And so I look forward to thinking about it. At this point, I don't have answers. I just know that there's new realities. Even the old questions are more acute right now. The criticisms of Israel are more acute. The demands of loyalty to Israel are more acute. The demands of security are more acute. The challenges of hatred, of evil, are at our doorstep, and we're not used to it. So I have a lot of thinking that I look forward to doing and to testing and to seeing how this meta story of Jewishness helps me. I hope it will. And I hope I'll continue to find in it a tool that leads me to be able to teach a Torah that could create a Judaism of meaning, and to have more Jews want to be a part of this story, to want to write the next chapter of this 3,000-year-old story.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you, Donniel, for speaking with us today, for writing this book, but maybe even more importantly, for your commitment to being a teacher and to working through this Torah, and for sharing your voice and vision with readers and communities across the globe. For those of you watching this who would like to make sure that you have a copy of this, again, this wonderful book, Who Are the Jews and Who Can We Become? You'll see a link in the comments to this recording. You can also visit our website, jps.org. And I know that I speak not just for myself, but for many people when I say that I'm eager to see where this thinking goes in the future and what this Judaism of meaning looks like for us and for those who come after us.
Thank you so much. It's just a delight to be with you. And thank you for pushing. Thank you also for, I've been completely engulfed in the war, and I've been in other mode. And thank you for helping me re-engage with my book. So it's really a pleasure to be with you.
Well, we are grateful to you for re-engaging and for kind of standing in that complicated space between Kind of imagining what you've already thought can help us today, but also being open to the possibility of rethinking in the future. We need more of that kind of intellectual integrity and intellectual vulnerability and kind of blend of humility and courage in contemporary thinking.
Thank you.